These are the films that I admire the most that have come out since I have become a director myself. The first movie is actually my favorite movie that has come out in the last 17 years, and that is...
Quentin Tarantino has finally done what fans have begged him to do for decades: reveal his favorite films from his own career. The director, famous for rewriting history on screen, has now turned the spotlight on himself.
I make movies for an audience. They indulge in big set pieces that gets an audience reaction. And to me, that's a good night at the movie.
Candidly admitting which movies he personally loves the most. Unfiltered and passionate, Tarantino's confessions reveal not only his favorites, but also the philosophy that shaped his filmmaking journey. Through interviews, debates, and his own reflections, we'll uncover his surprising picks, explore the stories behind them, and discover why one movie, above all, stands as the masterpiece he's most proud of: Tarantino and his obsession with movies. Quentin Tarantino never went to film school. He didn't need to. For him, movies were school, religion, and oxygen all rolled into one. Long before the world knew his name, a teenage Tarantino was haunting video rental stores in Los Angeles, not just watching movies, but devouring them. He would sit through double features at grindhouse theaters, binge on kung fu imports, Italian spaghetti westerns, and French New Wave classics, then argue with anyone who would listen about why Brian De Palma's split-screen technique was genius, or why Sergio Leone's pacing could turn silence into violence. That obsessive hunger didn't just make him a film fan, it turned him into a film machine. Tarantino's early jobs at Video Archives, a video rental store in Manhattan Beach, became the stuff of legend. Customers would walk in looking for a Friday night rental and end up getting a crash course in film history from the eccentric clerk behind the counter. He didn't just recommend movies, he curated experiences. Tarantino would hand someone a kung fu flick alongside a Howard Hawks western and insist they had to watch both to understand how cinema spoke across genres. To him, storytelling wasn't just about one movie. It was about a universe of influences colliding. When he finally sat down to write his own scripts, all of those thousands of hours of watching came pouring out. He didn't write like a studio screenwriter. He wrote like a fan who wanted to capture the rush of being punched in the gut by a perfect scene. Dialogue stretched and danced, not just moving the plot, but reveling in rhythm and attitude. Violence didn't just shock, it became operatic. Music choices weren't background, they were central characters. Everything he had absorbed, from cheap exploitation flicks to Golden Age classics, mutated into something entirely new. His obsession is embedded in his philosophy as a filmmaker. Unlike actors who can't bear to watch their own films, Tarantino loves revisiting his work. "I make films for myself. Everybody else is invited," he stated in one of the interviews. Each film for him is a time capsule of his love, a statement about the genres and influences he was obsessed with at that moment. He never tries to hide the fact that his films are personal mixtapes created out of decades of love affairs with cinema. That love for his own work is sometimes surprising to people. He speaks about nights he sat up flipping through the channels, found one of his films, and just had to watch. "Oh, hey, Jackie Brown is on. Well, I guess now I'm watching it for a while." He doesn't cringe. He doesn't look away. He enjoys them. To him, they're not just artifacts. They're very much alive. That is what renders the question of his favorite film so interesting. For years, Tarantino avoided it, claiming that choosing among his films was like choosing among his children. Other times, he changed his answers from year to year or with the weather. One day, it could be Kill Bill. Another day, Inglourious Bastards. He never would allow his fans to settle on one definitive answer because he wasn't ready to do that himself. But that hesitance was not indecision. It was dedication. Each film had a part of his soul, and he protected them all. His obsessive love of cinema did not allow him to see his work as a singular moment in his career or art, but rather as a continuum. To choose a favorite would have betrayed the others. Still, there were those few films that stood above the others in Tarantino's mind, those rare pictures where he felt that his vision was wholly realized, where his love of film and his creativity coincided in fateful union. And the first of these fully realized visions hit the world square in the face with a low-budget crime thriller that ignited the screen in an explosion of sheer force. It was the kind of debut that didn't just announce a new director. It declared a revolution, and his name was Quentin Tarantino. Quentin Tarantino's favorite films aren't just milestones in his career. They're the purest reflections of his lifelong obsession with cinema. And that obsession first announced itself in a debut so raw it shook indie filmmaking, followed by a cultural earthquake that redefined what modern movies could be. Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. When Quentin Tarantino walked into Hollywood with Reservoir Dogs in 1992, the industry didn't quite know what to make of him. Here was a former video store clerk with no formal training, directing a film so raw, violent, and sharp, it felt like a Molotov cocktail thrown into the quiet world of indie cinema. Shot on a shoestring budget of just over $1 million, it looked and sounded unlike anything else of its time. The film's claustrophobic setting, fractured timeline, and unapologetic brutality shocked audiences, but what really hooked them was the dialogue. These weren't gangsters talking in cliches. They were criminals debating Madonna lyrics, bickering about tipping waitresses and joking about pop culture like your buddies at a diner table. It was familiar, funny, and terrifying all at once. Tarantino turned conversations into tension and banter into art. When the infamous ear-cutting scene hit, scored to the upbeat rhythm of "Stuck in the Middle with You," audiences realized they were witnessing a director who could twist the ordinary into the unforgettable. Reservoir Dogs made Tarantino a name, but his next film, Pulp Fiction, 1994, made him a legend. Where Reservoir Dogs hinted at what he could do, Pulp Fiction was the full showcase. With a budget 10 times bigger and a cast that included John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson, Uma Thurman, and Bruce Willis, Tarantino delivered a non-linear crime epic that rewired Hollywood storytelling. Time didn't move in a straight line. Characters lived and died only to reappear in earlier chapters. Seemingly small moments turned into defining pivots. It was bold, playful, and deeply self-assured. This film was not merely a box office bomb, it was a cultural bomb. With Cannes awarding it the Palme d'Or, an Oscar for Tarantino's best original screenplay, and almost single-handedly resurrecting the acting career of John Travolta, it obviously became far more than just award recognition. Pulp Fiction reshaped audiences' very expectations of what a movie should be. Tarantino's characters were suddenly on everybody's lips. His dialogues, cool, rhythmic, endlessly quotable, became part of the vernacular. Every scene, from Jules Winfield's righteous indignation to Vincent Vega and those awful bathroom experiences, was instantly enshrined in the pantheon from the moment it showed on screen. For Tarantino, Pulp Fiction became more than just a milestone in his career. It was personal. Years of studying films had taught him that cinema could be alive, could be surprising, and above all, could be naughty. And with Pulp Fiction, he proved all of this in the global arena. He had taken the DNA of pulp novels, B-movies, French New Wave, and 70s grindhouse, and fused them into something that really felt retro and radically new at the same time. Years after its release, when asked which of his films could be considered the greatest, Tarantino confessed that Pulp Fiction would always be in contention. For its importance, yes, but more for what it represented. A fully realized dream of a young filmmaker. That's the one that changed everything, he said. And he is quite right in saying that. Without Pulp Fiction, so many filmmakers of the next era might not have had the headspace to experiment, remix genres, and bring dialogue-driven cinema closer toward the mainstream. But while Pulp Fiction remained, Tarantino glowed in its greatness. For him, filmmaking was a marathon, not a sprint. One masterpiece was not enough. A catalog of them was his goal. His next challenge would no longer be whether he could reduplicate the hit level. It was whether he could now maintain the level, and that across styles. Jackie Brown. After the cultural explosion of Pulp Fiction, the world expected Quentin Tarantino to deliver another fireball of adrenaline. More gangsters, more quotable dialogue, more blood. Instead, in 1997, he released Jackie Brown, a slow-burning crime drama adapted from Elmore Leonard's novel Rum Punch. To some fans, it felt like a curveball. Where Pulp Fiction had swagger and shock value, Jackie Brown moved with patience, restraint, and a world-weary maturity that many didn't see coming. But to Tarantino himself, this film has always held a special place. At its heart was Pam Grier, the blaxploitation icon of the 1970s. Casting her wasn't just nostalgia, it was reverence. Tarantino had worshipped her movies as a kid, and Jackie Brown became his chance to give her the role of a lifetime. As a middle-aged flight attendant caught between a gun-running boss and the federal agents chasing him, Grier brought grace, toughness, and vulnerability in equal measure. Alongside her, Robert Forster, another veteran actor Tarantino revived, delivered a quietly devastating performance as Max Cherry, the aging bail bondsman who falls in love with Jackie. Their chemistry gave the film its soul, replacing the kinetic chaos of Tarantino's earlier work with something far more tender. The movie's rhythm surprised audiences. Long stretches of dialogue were calm, measured, and almost meditative. Instead of quick-fire banter, Tarantino let conversations breathe, giving his characters time to reveal themselves in small glances, pauses, and silences. The violence, when it came, wasn't flashy or stylized. It was abrupt, matter-of-fact, and unsettling. For many fans who had come to Tarantino expecting spectacle, Jackie Brown seemed almost subdued. But beneath that surface calm was some of the most nuanced character work he had ever done. Critics have frequently been heard saying that much of it is a mature movie, not just about crime, but also about growing old, feeling regrets, and second chances. Tarantino has, however, always dropped hints that Jackie Brown ranks high on his personal list, although not high enough for mass consumption to rival Pulp Fiction. In interviews, he recounted those nights watching late-night television with one eye shut and his other eye on Jackie Brown, and giving in to its allure. It is not the loudest or the most talked about. Jackie Brown is the film that speaks most directly to his heart. Music is another fascinating element in the movie. Instead of being adrenaline-bursting ones, he thought to place mellow tracks ridden with soul by the Delphonics, Bobby Womack, and Randy Crawford songs nonetheless, accompanied by bittersweet undertones. The music didn't set a mood. It was a part of the film's emotional language. When Max is listening to the Delphonics in his car, it's not a soundtrack choice. It's a window into his yearning, his quiet hope that love is still a possibility. Jackie Brown has come a long way over the years. It was once dismissed by audiences, but now many see some of its subtleties and value it among Tarantino's best works. For Tarantino, however, it is more than his artistry doesn't stop at mere flash and shock. He knows how to tell a slow, deeper story, and so beautifully. Much as that, Jackie Brown was never pop culture, carried the same way as Pulp Fiction. That difference between its critical acclaim and public obsession just fueled Tarantino's desire to further dimensionalize his style and remind the world how bold, chaotic, and dangerous a voice it still spoke. Kill Bill. By the early 2000s, Quentin Tarantino had nothing left to prove. He'd already changed independent cinema with Reservoir Dogs, rewritten Hollywood's rulebook with Pulp Fiction, and silenced critics with the maturity of Jackie Brown. But Tarantino wasn't interested in resting on reputation. He wanted to go bigger, to test the limits of genre filmmaking, to see just how far cinema could stretch when fueled by pure obsession. That obsession became Kill Bill. Released in 2 volumes in 2003 and 2004, Kill Bill was unlike anything Tarantino had made before. It was violent, yes. In fact, it might be his most violent work. But the violence was stylized, almost balletic. Every blood spray, every sword strike, every duel was choreographed like a dance. Tarantino wasn't just making a revenge film. He was making a tribute to the movies that raised him. Shaw Brothers kung fu epics, samurai dramas, spaghetti westerns, and grindhouse revenge flicks. At the center of it all was Uma Thurman, returning as Tarantino's muse after her iconic turn in Pulp Fiction. As the bride, Thurman became both mythic and human, a wronged woman who survives an assassination attempt and claws her way back to vengeance. Her yellow jumpsuit, borrowed in homage to Bruce Lee, became an instant pop culture image. And the weapon in her hands, a samurai sword forged by the legendary Hattori Hanzo, symbolized not just her mission, but Tarantino's own devotion to cinematic myth. The way a film is set up is a lot of Tarantino's maximalism. Instead of telling one simple revenge story, he divided it into 2 sprawling volumes. Volume 1 was a whirlwind of violence, beginning with an anime sequence about O-Ren Ishii's backstory and culminating in the astounding House of Blue Leaves fight, where the bride took on the crazy 88 all alone in a classic operatic spectacle that left the audience in stunned silence, whereas Volume 2 was the opposite, in that it slowed down to explore character, philosophy, and emotional resolution. Kill Bill was not so much an end in itself, as it was the search for a meaning behind the bloodshed. For Tarantino, Kill Bill was a breaking point. Not making movies, building a movie universe with everything he loves, with an evident relationship to most of the classic cinema, not too true. The references weren't subtle, just celebratory. Not everyone needed to catch every allusion to Japanese cinema, Italian westerns, or American exploitation to enjoy it. But for Tarantino, those details were his private love letters to the movies that shaped him. Yet, with the established criticism over whether the 2 volumes must be separated or not, audience response was simply undeniable. Kill Bill put out Tarantino's signature as the ultimate genre alchemist, a film manufacturer that would take his pulp ingredients and mold them into high art. Uma Thurman's performance soon became iconic, as the bride's journey into vengeance carved itself into celluloid history as the most defining revenge sagas ever. When asked years later to name his favorite of his own movies, it was rarely Kill Bill that was picked by Tarantino. But he always spoke of it proudly, as if it were some evidence that his imagination knew no ceiling. "That's the movie where I just went for it," he once said. And audiences could feel that freedom in every frame, the sense that Tarantino was unleashing every cinematic dream he'd ever harbored. If Kill Bill was him going all in, the next film shows what happens when he changes the game itself. Inglourious Basterds. When Quentin Tarantino unveiled Inglourious Basterds in 2009, audiences weren't entirely sure what to expect. Was it going to be a straightforward World War II movie? A revenge fantasy? A spaghetti western disguised in Nazi uniforms? In truth, it was all of those things and more. What Tarantino created was not just another war film, but a cinematic manifesto, a story about the power of movies themselves. The film's opening scene set the tone immediately. A French farmer, hiding a Jewish family under his floorboards, sits across from SS Colonel Hans Landa, played with terrifying charm by Christoph Waltz. The dialogue stretches on, polite and tense, until the truth leaks out like smoke. It's classic Tarantino, suspense born not from gunfire, but from words. By the time the scene erupts into violence, the audience is already breathless. That precision earned Waltz an Academy Award and introduced one of cinema's most memorable villains. But the brilliance of Inglourious Basterds wasn't only in its characters, it was in how Tarantino wielded cinema itself as both weapon and salvation. In the movie's climax, history doesn't play out as it did in textbooks. Instead, Adolf Hitler and his highest-ranking officers are blown to pieces inside a movie theater, destroyed not by soldiers on the battlefield, but by the literal flames of celluloid film stock. Tarantino wasn't shy about the symbolism. Movies have the power to rewrite history, to avenge, to destroy evil in ways reality never could. The praise from the critics was, and still is, for years etched in Tarantino's well-earned dialogue and style and his references to pop culture. But this time, Bastards delivered something different. It was audacity. He took one of the most sordid parts of human history, or rather, twisted it into a sort of fairy tale where the oppressed not only survived, but won. Even while such notions angered some historians, audiences and critics saw the deeper significance. Tarantino was not making a documentary. He was making a fantasy that cinema could supply a place where, however outlandish it seemed, justice would eventually play out. The film's ensemble cast added dimension and unpredictability. Pitt's Aldo Raine instantly became a favorite with audiences through his Tennessee drawl and trademark scar, leading a motley crew of bastards who specialized in scalp-hunting Nazis. Melanie Laurent's Shosanna Dreyfus injected emotional heft, the quiet grief burning up in a rage as she planned destruction against the regime that took her family life away. Each storyline had its different energy, but they all ended in that fateful theater. A finale, fully cathartic and shocking. For Tarantino, Inglourious Basterds was a real claim to fame, as he often described it as one of the best films that he has ever made. Sometimes, indeed, his outright favorite. Critics agreed. Esquire called it his magnum opus, praising its fearless mixing of pulp fiction sensibilities with historical heft, and it had thus proved that Tarantino can evolve, that his filmmaking can be more than homage and genre play, that it could grapple with history itself and still maintain his signature voice. Bastards is perhaps more important in terms of having wrestled the conversation surrounding Tarantino's career away from mere provocation or master of dialogue. It was said that cinema can act against an event, an act of vengeance, an alternate version of rewriting collective memory. As in, that's the point that Tarantino made. Film was more than just entertainment. It was power. Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight. After Inglourious Basterds exploded into cinemas and rewrote history with celluloid fire, Quentin Tarantino turned his attention to a past much closer to home: America's original sins. If Bastards asked what cinema could do to fascism, Django Unchained, 2012, and The Hateful Eight, 2015, asked what cinema could do to slavery, racism, and the bloody contradictions at the core of American identity. With Django Unchained, Tarantino broke new ground by crafting a spaghetti western in the Deep South, or as he called it, a Southern. The story followed Django, a freed slave turned bounty hunter, played with ferocity by Jamie Foxx. Partnering with Christoph Waltz's charming Dr. King Schultz, Django sets out not just for revenge, but for love. Rescuing his wife Broomhilda from the clutches of Calvin Candy, the sadistic plantation owner played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Tarantino described Django as his revenge opera against the institution of slavery, a genre-bending spectacle that fused pulp violence with historical outrage. The bloodshed was operatic, the satire biting, and the catharsis undeniable. When Django finally turned Candyland into a blazing inferno, audiences cheered not just for the character, but for the symbolic destruction of an entire system of cruelty. Spike Lee criticized Tarantino's liberal use of the N-word, sparking debates about appropriation and provocation, but Tarantino defended the choice as essential to honesty. For him, slavery was too brutal to be softened. It had to be confronted with all its ugliness intact. The success of Django Unchained was staggering. It became Tarantino's highest-grossing film and won him his second Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. Christoph Waltz, once again, walked away with an Oscar. More importantly, the film ignited conversations about how cinema portrays slavery and whether pulp-style storytelling could be a vessel for historical reckoning. Tarantino seemed to prove that it could, but that was not the end. 3 years later, he came back with The Hateful Eight, a film that seemed on the surface to be a chamber mystery set in a snowy Wyoming cabin after the Civil War. What old but definitely proved to be more, although it pretended to unfold like a locked-room whodunit. It was a brutal allegory of America itself, mistrustful, violent, racially divided, and haunted by the ghosts of war. These were bounty hunters, criminals, soldiers, and liars from a shattered nation. Major Marquis Warren, in Samuel L. Jackson's portrayal, with sharp monologues and seething anger, serves as the correlative center of a narrative in which the very idea of morality was dubious. Being set flat against the claustrophobic splendor of 70mm, it forced the audience into the tension of America's unresolved wars. Every betrayal, every word of spilled secret, every drop of blood on the floor of the cabin felt like a symbol of a nation birthed in suspicion and violence. It met with a mixed critical reception, with some claiming it is one of Tarantino's boldest statements, less flamboyant than Django, but far more cynical, more searching. If Django were a revenge fantasy, The Hateful Eight was a mirror, showing America its own mercilessly scarred face. In Tarantino's view, these two films marked an important change. They were a testimony that an evolving facet of his personality was not merely homage. It was more of wrestling through history with pulp, westerns, and exploitation tropes. In Europe, he had already burned the Reichstag. In America, he went ahead and burned down the plantation and trapped its survivors within a cabin full of distrust. And in their respective ways, they interrogated whether cinema can stand in for justice where history has paled. Save your breath for the finale, because Tarantino's last word on the matter isn't just another film, it's the one he calls his very best. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. When Quentin Tarantino finally revealed which of his films he considered his greatest achievement, he didn't hesitate. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. For years, he had dodged the question, brushing it off with lines like, "They're all my children," or "It depends on when you ask me." But by his own admission, this 2019 epic was different. It wasn't just another Tarantino film. It was his magnum opus, the culmination of everything he had been building toward since the beginning of his career. Set in 1969, Los Angeles, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood unfolds against a backdrop of shifting cultural tides. Old Hollywood, with its westerns and tough guy actors, was fading, while the counterculture, trees, new Hollywood auteurs, and even darker forces, like the Manson family, were rising. At the center of this transition stood two fictional characters: Rick Dalton, a fading TV star played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and his stunt double Cliff Booth, brought to life with laid-back charm by Brad Pitt. Their friendship became the emotional anchor of the film, a nostalgic ode to male camaraderie in an industry often defined by competition and ego. For Tarantino, this film was a love letter to Hollywood, to cinema, and to an era that shaped his identity as a filmmaker. He poured into it every obsession, from the neon glow of Los Angeles streets to the forgotten TV shows he grew up watching, to the intricate details of movie posters and radio jingles. The entire production felt like Tarantino's own time machine, meticulously reconstructing a world he once only knew through TV reruns and stories from older film buffs. But what made Once Upon a Time in Hollywood especially powerful was its fusion of nostalgia with revisionist fantasy. Just as he had done with Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained, Tarantino used cinema to rewrite history. In real life, the Manson family brutally slayed actress Sharon Tate and several of her friends, a crime that has haunted Hollywood for decades. In Tarantino's version, however, the slayers never reach Tate. Instead, they stumble into Rick and Cliff's orbit, where their violence is turned back on them in a delirious, bloody climax that left audiences both shocked and strangely comforted. Sharon Tate, a role excellently played by Margot Robbie, becomes a path to fantasy redemption for Tarantino, Hollywood, and maybe even himself. The emphasis is less on vengeance and more on innocence protection. For some critics, this is Tarantino at his most vulnerable. A man with the tools of pulp cinema in his hands, not to punish but to mend. The movie received acclaim of epic proportions. Cliff Booth earned Brad Pitt his first Oscar for acting, and Tarantino was nominated for writing and directing. But that was never the point for Tarantino. In fact, he stated on multiple occasions that he loved watching this movie more than any of his others. He even went so far as to say, "To me, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is my best movie." That statement from a man known for his bravado is more clarity than arrogance. After 4 decades of filmmaking, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood feels like an inevitable film. The only film Tarantino could have made at this point in his life. It is at once a sprawling epic and an intimate work, violent yet nostalgic, fantastical somewhere yet deeply personal. It sums up his being more than any other film, a man who loves movies so much that he rewrites history to give his beloved films an ending worthy of their acquaintance. What makes this choice even more suitable is how it reflects Tarantino's journey. Just as Rick Dalton wrestles with the fading relevance, Cliff Booth is like a relic from an age now gone. Tarantino wrote Once Upon a Time in Hollywood as both his goodbye and his love note. This is a film about transitions, old and new, myth and reality, violence and tenderness. In that case, by choosing it as his greatest achievement, he seems to acknowledge where he fits into that continuum. For audiences, the movie becomes more than entertainment. It's a window on Tarantino's heart, where every frame is both memory and goodbye, as personal as it is monumental, setting off yet another barrier curtain in the teeming halls of cinema. Quentin Tarantino may have named his favorites, but the debate will rage on long after the credits roll. Hit like, drop your own Tarantino ranking in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more stories straight from Hollywood's cutting room floor. And don't leave just yet. The next video is queued up on your screen, ready to take you even deeper into the movies that shaped our world.